December 1941. A wind like knives swept across the Russian plain. Snow buried the wreckage of tanks, horses, and men alike. An endless white graveyard stretching from Smolensk to Moscow. Somewhere beneath that frozen wasteland lay the bones of an empire that had believed itself invincible. The Germans called it Unternehmen Barbarossa. To them, it was a campaign of lightning victory. To the Soviets, it became something else entirely. A test of endurance no army in history had ever survived. The German generals had promised Hitler they would reach Moscow in 8 weeks. They had not planned for a winter where steel shattered like glass and soldiers froze upright in their trenches. They had not imagined that beyond every destroyed village, another division of the Red Army would appear, starved, half-armed, but unbroken. By the first days of December, the Wehrmacht stood at the gates of the Soviet capital. They could see the faint glow of Moscow's burning suburbs on the horizon. But what they didn't see, what they couldn't comprehend, was the vast machine stirring behind that glow. It wasn't tanks or planes. It was something far more dangerous, a logistical miracle, born not from wealth but from desperation. Every rifle, every shell, every loaf of bread that reached the front traveled thousands of kilometers through frozen rail lines, snow-clogged roads, and the trembling hands of millions of women, peasants, and factory workers who refused to stop. In the factories of the Urals, teenagers worked 18-hour shifts beside furnaces that never cooled. In Siberia, entire cities had been dismantled, their machinery loaded onto trains and rebuilt 1,000 miles east in less than a month. The Germans believed Soviet industry had been destroyed. In truth, it had merely moved, farther from their reach, deeper into the storm. What followed was not strategy. It was survival elevated to an art form. Trains ran without schedules, their routes decided by need, not by maps. Engineers repaired bridges in temperatures where oil turned solid. Soldiers marched without boots, but rifles never stopped firing. And on the outskirts of Moscow, as German officers wrote their reports on final advances, 1 million Soviet troops gathered in silence. They had no winter uniforms, no fuel, barely enough ammunition, but they had something else, an unbroken supply chain that defied both reason and physics. When the counteroffensive came on December 5th, it wasn't just an army that attacked. It was a nation, one that had turned its last reserves of strength, coal, and blood into momentum. For the first time since the war began, the Germans retreated. They called it a tactical withdrawal. History would call it the moment the tide began to turn. When Moscow froze beneath that merciless sky, the battle for the front lines was only half the war. The other half, invisible to generals and maps, was being fought thousands of kilometers behind the trenches in places that didn't yet exist. They called it the Great Evacuation. In the summer and autumn of 1941, as German divisions swallowed Ukraine and Belarus, as the Luftwaffe turned cities into rubble, the Soviet Union performed a logistical miracle unmatched in history. In just 5 months, over 1,500 factories, entire industrial cities, were uprooted and carried eastward piece by piece across the Ural Mountains, across the Volga, across the threshold between survival and extinction. Steel presses the size of houses were loaded onto flat cars. Machine tools were dismantled under bombardment. Workers, Engineers and families were packed into unheated cattle wagons. Trains moved day and night. Their cargo not just metal, but the future itself. No nation had ever attempted such an operation, and none would ever attempt it again. German intelligence didn't even believe the reports. They thought the Soviets were bluffing, that chaos and panic had consumed the state. They couldn't comprehend that the same people retreating from Smolensk and Kiev were, at that very moment, rebuilding their entire industrial base in the wilderness. At stations in the Urals and Siberia, trains would arrive like ghosts out of the blizzard. Hundreds a day, brakes screaming, steam hissing into the frozen air. They carried not only machines, but memories. The last bolts from Kharkov, the blueprints from Leningrad, the workers from Donbass who had fled with nothing but their hands. There were no buildings waiting for them, only empty fields. And yet, within weeks, furnaces were roaring again, under makeshift roofs of canvas and tin. Sparks danced above the snow, while entire families lived inside the factory walls, sleeping between lathes and furnaces. Children fetched coal, women operated presses, old men assembled rifles by lantern light. Every hammer strike in those ghost factories echoed louder than artillery. It was the sound of a nation refusing to die. By the winter of 1942, these relocated plants, once scattered across Europe's farthest frontier, were producing at full capacity. The numbers defied belief. Tanks rolled off the lines of Chelyabinsk, a city the workers renamed Tankograd, Tank City. Engines for Yak fighters screamed into life in the cold hangars of Omsk. In the forests of Sverdlovsk, ammunition factories ran 24 hours a day under blackout curtains. The Germans, stalled before Moscow, still believed they had destroyed Soviet industry. But in truth, the factories had multiplied. They were no longer targets the Luftwaffe could find. They were hidden behind mountains, buried under snow, spread like veins across the continent. When the first T-34 tanks rolled westward again, they carried with them more than armor. They carried the impossible fact that a nation starving, freezing, and retreating had somehow found a way to outproduce the richest war machine in Europe. Each tank was a moving equation: labor, distance, sacrifice. It took 4 tons of steel, 2 tons of coal, 3 tons of ore, and 100 hours of human life to make one. Behind every T-34 was a mother who hadn't slept, a boy who lost his father, a line of workers who'd buried their friends in the factory yard and gone back to their posts. The Soviet front didn't advance by tactics alone. It advanced because behind it, an entire civilization had learned to move. Railways ran not by schedule but by instinct. Engineers memorized the sounds of the tracks instead of reading instruments. Trains carrying ammunition would speed through enemy air raids without stopping. Some never made it, turned to twisted metal in the snow. But there was always another behind it, and another after that. By 1942, the Red Army was receiving more tanks than it could field. By 1943, it was producing more artillery than all of Europe combined. And by 1944, Soviet factories east of the Urals, built by peasants and children under candlelight, were supplying 3 fronts across 3,000 kilometers of war. The Germans couldn't understand it. How could a nation half-starved and half-frozen still produce at such scale? How could its people work with a discipline born not of fear, but of belief? What they didn't understand was that for the Soviet people, production itself had become warfare. Every bullet was an act of vengeance. Every tank was a grave marker. Every train that left Siberia carried not just weapons, but the will to survive, packed into crates of steel and sweat. When the snows began to melt in the spring of 1942 and the first Soviet counteroffensives rolled west, German reconnaissance pilots sent confused reports back to Berlin. New tank models cited, quantity unknown, factories appear relocated, production undiminished. The intelligence officers reading those reports didn't know it yet, but the arithmetic of the war had already turned against them. The Reich still held the ground, the air, and the initiative. But the Soviets held something far more dangerous. They held momentum. And momentum, once it begins to move, is a weapon no general can stop. Spring 1942. The snow melted into mud, swallowing boots and wheels alike. The war that had frozen solid now turned liquid. Rivers overflowing, roads dissolving, and beneath the filth and thaw, an empire learning to breathe again. Everywhere across the vastness of the Soviet Union, the same sound began to rise. Steel striking steel. Hammers, presses, the screech of cranes, a symphony of survival echoing from the Urals to the Volga. The Red Army was learning what the Wehrmacht had once believed to be their monopoly: mobility. The Germans had invented blitzkrieg, lightning war. But now they were facing a lightning storm of factories, trains, and trucks that refused to stop. The front lines may have shifted, but behind them, a machine of staggering scale had come alive, not organized by a single hand, but by millions of them. The heart of it all was the Volga, a river that had seen 1,000 wars and 1,000 empires rise and fall. But never before had it carried so much metal. By the summer of 1942, the Volga had become an artery of war, the lifeline of the Red Army. Barges, ferries, and steamers moved day and night, loaded with tanks, guns, fuel, food, and the most precious cargo of all: men. The Germans, now pushing towards Stalingrad, called it madness. They bombed the river daily, turning the waves black with oil and wreckage. But every night, under the cover of darkness, the convoys began again. Some of the boats were so overloaded that their decks kissed the water. Some never made it halfway, but those that did became legends. At the shipyards of Gorky, old tugboats were reforged into troop carriers. Fishermen became captains. Teenagers piloted barges filled with ammunition through artillery fire. And on the riverbanks, soldiers would watch the silhouettes of these boats drift past, silent, low, unstoppable, like ghosts delivering vengeance. The Germans thought they were fighting an army. They were wrong. They were fighting a civilization in motion. In Moscow, Stalin's planners called it the River Network Strategy, a logistical map that treated every river, rail, and dirt road as a weapon. They calculated everything: time, distance, consumption, attrition. They knew exactly how much fuel a tank would burn between Stalingrad and the Caucasus, how many bridges could bear its weight, how many trains must depart each day just to keep a single division alive. And the numbers were terrifying. To keep one front operational required 12,000 tons of supplies daily. To move those supplies took over 15,000 trains per month. Every bullet fired at the front was the result of 1,000 hands behind it. Yet somehow, impossibly, it worked. The Soviet Union, a country where half the population had no electricity before the war, had built the largest supply system the world had ever seen. It was not elegant. It was raw, improvised, brutal. But it was endless. If a bridge was destroyed, another was built beside it in a single night. If a train derailed, its cargo was transferred by hand to trucks, by truck to horses, and by horses to sledges. No rule book could explain how the system functioned. It functioned because it had to. And then came Stalingrad. It wasn't just another battle. It was a black hole that consumed everything: men, machines, and faith itself. By September 1942, the city was burning, and the Volga ran red. The Germans called it the Rattenkrieg, the War of the Rats. And for good reason. Street by street, floor by floor, soldiers fought for every wall. Factories turned into fortresses. Workshops continued producing ammunition under fire, even as their roofs collapsed. In the Red October steel plant, molten metal continued to pour even as artillery shells rained from above. Workers and soldiers were indistinguishable, both covered in soot, both armed. Men would leave the assembly line with a freshly built submachine gun, load it, and step out the door straight into combat. German officers couldn't comprehend it. They reported to Berlin that enemy resistance exceeds all rational expectation. What they didn't understand was that for the Soviets, Stalingrad wasn't a city anymore. It was a symbol. The heart of the nation's supply lines, the gateway to the Volga, the artery of survival. If Stalingrad fell, the river would be cut, and if the river died, the Red Army would starve. So the Soviets didn't let it die. Trains from the Urals arrived without pause, carrying tanks and shells. Women unloaded crates by hand. Teenagers repaired tracks under bombing runs. Entire rail crews perished keeping the line open. And the next morning, replacements arrived before the smoke had cleared. Each shipment across the Volga cost lives. Each boat sunk meant 50 men drowned. And yet the next night, another boat would depart, carrying more men, more fuel, more hope. The Germans thought it madness, and they were right. But it was a madness that endured longer than their reason. By winter, the Volga froze solid. The city became a world of fire and ice, where bodies were used to reinforce trenches and tanks burned so long their hulls melted into the earth. The Germans had taken 90% of Stalingrad, and then, in that frozen wasteland, the Red Army did what no one thought possible. They encircled the encirclers. Operation Uranus, the counter-offensive, struck from the north and south, collapsing the German front like glass under a hammer. Entire armies vanished. When the trap closed, the Sixth Army found itself cut off from all supplies, surrounded by the very people they had starved and bombed for months. It was a reversal so complete that German historians would still write about it 50 years later with disbelief. How had the starving defeated the well-fed? How had those with nothing managed to build the machine that crushed them? The answer lay not in numbers, not even in courage, but in the will to move. Every train that crossed the Urals, every boat that survived the Volga, every pair of frozen hands that kept the steel flowing westward, that was the true front line of Stalingrad. When the snow finally buried the ruins of the city in February 1943, and the last German officer surrendered, the Red Army didn't cheer. They simply stared eastward toward the factories that had made this victory possible. The river of iron still flowed, unstoppable, tireless, carrying with it a new kind of power. For the first time since 1941, the world understood. The Soviet Union could not be destroyed. Not by cold, not by hunger, not by the Wehrmacht, not by God Himself. Because behind every rifle on the front stood a nation that refused to stop moving. Summer 1943. The smoke over Stalingrad had barely cleared when the earth began to tremble again. Not from German artillery this time, but from the thunder of Soviet engines. Across the fields of Kursk, thousands of tanks gathered under the rising sun, their hulls still bearing the scars of the winter before. Men who had crawled through the ashes of Stalingrad now stood beside machines built by hands that never saw the front. Hands that hammered steel in the Urals, that turned despair into armor. What came next would become legend. The Battle of Kursk, the largest clash of armor the world had ever seen. But behind the thunder of guns was another sound. Quieter, constant. The steady heartbeat of logistics. Without it, there would have been no victory. Without it, those tanks would have been empty shells, rusting in the mud. The Germans called their offensive Operation Citadel. They believed they still understood the laws of war. That movement, precision, and speed would once again crush their enemies. They had no idea that by 1943, the Red Army had rewritten those laws entirely. For 2 years, the Soviets had built not just tanks and guns, but a new system of war, one that moved like a living organism. Every mile of track, every drop of oil, every bullet was a nerve in that vast body. The railway lines that once carried refugees now carried vengeance. The old wooden bridges were replaced by steel, built overnight by engineers who measured their success not in meters but in hours. Where the Germans saw terrain, the Soviets saw pathways. Rivers, forests, mud. Nothing stopped the flow. From Siberia to the steppe, trains thundered westward in endless lines, bearing the names of cities that no longer existed. Kiev, Smolensk, Kharkov. Each train carried the ghosts of those places back to the front, transformed into fuel, shells, and tanks. To feed the front around Kursk required 9,000 tons of supplies a day. In 1941, such a figure would have been unthinkable. By 1943, it was routine. Every division had a network of supply points, field workshops, mobile bakeries, medical trains, all functioning in synchronization that even German officers later admitted they could never replicate. The Red Army had learned what their enemies once knew best, that movement wins wars. On July 5, 1943, the German assault began. From the air, their tanks appeared like dark waves rolling toward the Soviet trenches. 2,700 armored vehicles, the finest the Reich could build. But the Red Army was waiting. For months, they had dug in, 20 miles deep, with interlocking defenses, minefields, and anti-tank guns spaced like clockwork. And behind those defenses, like arteries feeding a giant heart, the Soviet supply trains never stopped. Even as shells exploded and dust turned the air to blood, fuel convoys rolled forward. Trucks marked with red stars moved through fire as if guided by instinct. When one was destroyed, another took its place within the hour. Mechanics repaired engines under artillery fire, using spare parts welded from wreckage. Men slept beside their machines, waking only when the rumble of the next convoy arrived. German commanders soon realized something was wrong. Their tanks were fighting an enemy that did not seem to run out, of ammunition, of men, of will. For every tiger that roared forward, there were 3 T-34s waiting. For every shell fired, a new one arrived by nightfall. It was as if the Red Army drew its strength from the earth itself. In truth, that strength came from far away, from the smoke-filled factories of the Urals, from the women who worked 16 hours at the presses, from the endless rhythm of the railroads that fed the front like veins feeding a beating heart. At Prokhorovka, the heart of the battle, the air itself seemed to ignite. More than 1,500 tanks collided in a storm of fire and iron. Crews fought at point-blank range, 50 meters, sometimes less. Engines screamed, armor melted, men burned inside their machines. It was not battle. It was annihilation. And yet, the Soviets did not yield. Even when ammunition ran low, even when fuel tanks ran dry, the convoys came. At night, trains crept forward under blackout, their engineers steering by memory, not light. When tracks were bombed, soldiers laid down planks and sleepers by hand. Entire trains were sacrificed to keep the line moving. Engines overloaded, boilers cracked, but they pressed on. By the third day, the German offensive had stalled. The Wehrmacht, once master of motion, was now caught in its own trap, bled dry by a machine that moved faster than it could think. Kursk was not won by tanks or tactics. It was won by the invisible, by logistics, by will, by the relentless rhythm of an industrial miracle. After Kursk, something irreversible happened. The Red Army no longer defended. It advanced. The flow of supplies reversed direction, east to west, from the Urals to the Dnieper, from despair to revenge. Each kilometer reclaimed was fed by thousands of wagons, each wagon a fragment of the colossal engine behind them. Fuel lines were extended across newly liberated territory. Mobile repair units followed the tanks like shadows. The front had become a moving city, rolling across Europe at 30 kilometers a day. For the Germans, this was the beginning of the end. Their trains ran empty. Their fuel stocks dwindled. Every attempt to counterattack met a wall of fire. A wall built not just by soldiers, but by the workers who had forged their weapons in secret, under the cold light of factory lamps. By autumn, the balance of the war had shifted permanently. The Red Army was now the hammer, not the anvil. The same trains that had once fled east were now roaring back west, carrying the vengeance of millions. Kiev, Smolensk, and Kharkov were liberated one by one. Each victory measured not only in lives, but in tonnage. Every bridge rebuilt, every track repaired, every train that rolled through the night carried with it the same message. You took everything from us. Now we will take everything from you. And still, the Soviets did not stop. Their strength came not from the perfection of their system, but from its chaos, from the sheer, impossible scale of it. Engines broke, rails twisted, trucks froze, men collapsed from exhaustion, and yet the machine kept moving. It moved because it could not afford to stop. It moved because behind every frontline soldier there stood another, and behind them an entire nation willing them forward. By the end of 1943, the Red Army had crossed the Dnieper. For the first time since the war began, German soldiers were retreating not to regroup, but to survive. The Soviet war machine, crude, immense, unrelenting, had become what the Germans had once been, the storm, and it was still gathering strength. Summer 1944. The thunder that began at Kursk had not faded. It had only gathered strength. Across the endless plains of Belarus, forests shook as artillery shells streaked westward. The Red Army, once fighting for every meter of its own soil, now moved like a storm toward Europe. And at the heart of that storm was something the Germans had never truly understood: a logistics network vast enough to move an entire civilization. The operation was named Bagration, after a Georgian general of the Napoleonic Wars. A deliberate insult to the Germans, who still idolized their victories over Russia in 1812. They expected another stalemate, another slow Soviet grind. Instead, what came was a tidal wave. 2.3 million men, 5,800 tanks, 5,300 aircraft, and 500,000 trucks. It was not just an army. It was a continent in motion. To move such a force required miracles of coordination. The front stretched across 700 kilometers, from the Pripyat marshes to the Baltic forests. And yet, each sector moved as if guided by a single pulse. Fuel dumps, supply depots, and repair yards appeared seemingly overnight. Bridges destroyed by retreating Germans were rebuilt in hours. Entire railways were shifted westward as the front advanced. German intelligence officers intercepting radio transmissions couldn't comprehend it. They heard constant reports of movement, tanks here, artillery there. But behind the noise, they sensed something more terrifying: an invisible rhythm. They were fighting not just an enemy army, but a system that refused to exhaust itself. Where German lines of communication were crumbling, the Soviets had learned to bend space itself. They moved railheads forward every night, extending supply lines at impossible speed. When locomotives couldn't keep up, the Red Army simply converted captured German trains to their own gauge. Sometimes within a single day, entire battalions of railway troops followed the advance, armed not with rifles, but with hammers and steel rails. They repaired bridges with timber torn from ruined villages, laid new track across minefields, and kept the lifeblood of the offensive flowing west. Each day, 12,000 trains moved supplies toward the front. Each carried hundreds of tons of shells, food, and fuel. And behind each one were thousands of workers, engineers, and farmers whose names history would never remember. The Red Army's strength wasn't only measured in men and machines. It was measured in movement. When Bagration began on June 22, 1944, exactly 3 years after the German invasion, it did not begin with drums or speeches. It began with silence. At 3 a.m., along a front stretching hundreds of kilometers, Soviet artillery opened fire with a precision the Germans had never imagined possible. Within minutes, entire sections of the German line ceased to exist. Then came the tanks. Endless, roaring, dust-covered columns that rolled forward not in chaos, but in rhythm. Behind them came the convoys: fuel trucks, repair teams, ambulances, kitchens, radio vans, each one part of the same relentless machine. The Germans tried to retreat, but they discovered too late that their escape routes no longer existed. Bridges were gone, fuel depots captured, and their supply lines, once their greatest advantage, were now their tombs. For every kilometer they fell back, the Soviets advanced 3. In 3 weeks, Army Group Center, the pride of the Wehrmacht, ceased to exist. 28 divisions gone. Over 300,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. German officers wrote later that it felt as if the Red Army had simply erased them. But the truth was even colder. They were buried under the weight of logistics. Behind the front, the Soviet machine devoured and rebuilt the land as it advanced. In every liberated town, engineers arrived first, not soldiers. They restored electricity, repaired roads, reopened railways. Children carried water. Women gathered scrap metal. Old men drove trucks. War had transformed every citizen into part of the supply chain. The Soviet Union no longer had civilians, only participants. The Red Army called these mobile support networks Frontovie Goroda, front-line cities. They were temporary metropolises of tents, cranes, fuel depots, and repair yards, following the army west like shadows. At any given time, hundreds of thousands of workers lived within 20 kilometers of the front, rebuilding faster than the Germans could destroy. Where the Wehrmacht relied on meticulous planning, the Soviets relied on movement and improvisation. If one route failed, 5 more appeared. If one bridge collapsed, another rose by dawn. By the time Soviet forces reached Minsk in early July, Bagration had already become the most successful offensive in modern history. In 30 days, the Red Army had advanced 500 kilometers, farther and faster than the Germans ever had in 1941. To the Germans, it seemed impossible. To the Soviets, it was simply the result of preparation. Fuel was the pulse of the offensive. Without it, even the mightiest tank became a coffin. So, along every highway, convoys of fuel trucks, benzovozi, roared forward in endless columns. Drivers slept at the wheel, hallucinating from exhaustion. They drove through fire, through air raids, through nights lit by burning forests. When their vehicles broke down, they siphoned fuel by hand into smaller cans, carrying it across minefields to the tanks waiting beyond. In the forests of Belarus, witnesses would later tell of nights when the air itself smelled of gasoline and pine, the scent of war moving westward. These convoys became legends among the troops. Soldiers cheered when they arrived, calling them the veins of the motherland. One driver recalled, "We didn't fight the war with rifles, we fought it with wheels." And he was right. The tanks that smashed through German lines, the artillery that silenced the last bunkers, the planes that flew over the front, all of them were powered by that unbroken flow of motion. As the offensive surged into Poland, the world finally saw what the Germans had learned too late. The Soviet Union was no longer defending. It was rebuilding the world in its own image. Each kilometer advanced brought railways, fuel, food, and soldiers closer to the heart of Europe. The Red Army wasn't just chasing the enemy. It was dragging its own country behind it. A living empire of steel, smoke, and will. When the German command finally realized the scale of the disaster, it was already too late. Army Group North was cut off. Army Group South retreating in chaos. Berlin's generals shouted for counterattacks, but their words were drowned out by the rumble of trains, the echo of engines, and the roar of millions marching west. The avalanche could not be stopped. It did not move fast. It moved inevitably. Every day, every hour, the machine advanced another step, another bridge, another road closer to Germany. And behind that machine marched a truth carved into every soldier's mind. We are not fighting for ground anymore. We are fighting for memory, for every village they burned, for every grave they left behind. We will not stop until their world burns too. Autumn 1944. The war that had begun as a defense of soil was now a march through ashes. From the Dnieper to the Vistula, every field, every ruined town, every broken bridge carried the same message. The Red Army was coming, and it would not stop. The great machine that had been born in the factories of the Urals now spanned half a continent. Its arteries ran westward, pulsing with trains, convoys, and the endless rhythm of war. Each new offensive no longer felt like a single operation. It was a continuation of one vast, unstoppable movement, rolling over everything that stood between Moscow and Berlin. But victory, like everything else in this war, had to be carried there. By late 1944, the Red Army controlled a territory larger than Western Europe itself. To feed, arm, and move, such a force demanded a scale of logistics unseen in human history. Every day, 13,000 tons of supplies crossed the Vistula. Every hour, another train left the east, its flat cars loaded with tanks, its boxcars filled with bread, boots, and blood. In the rear, Soviet railway engineers worked with the precision of surgeons and the endurance of saints. They built rail lines so fast that German prisoners refused to believe their eyes. One captured officer wrote later, "They repair in a night what we plan for a month. We destroy. They build. It is as if the land itself obeys them." But it was not the land. It was the people. Millions of them. Women who worked at machine tools until their hands bled, then took shifts loading shells. Farmers who harvested by hand so that soldiers at the front could eat. Children who ran messages along bombed roads, dodging shellfire. They were the invisible army. And by 1944, they were everywhere. The Red Army itself had become a city on the move. Behind every frontline formation came an entire civilization. Fuel depots, bakeries, field hospitals, printing presses, even mobile cinemas. The roads, stretching through Poland and Belarus, were lined with workshops. Repair units where tanks were welded back together in the open air, under rain and snow. Engineers slept beside their machines, their faces black with soot. When spare parts ran out, they tore what they needed from destroyed German vehicles. The war had turned resourcefulness into doctrine. Fuel remained the lifeblood. At night, convoys of benzovozi, fuel trucks, drove without headlights, guided only by stars and the memory of the road. They called themselves ghost drivers. Some never returned. When trucks burned, others drove through the flames to reach the front. The war had taught them a single rule. Motion was survival, and so they moved. Endlessly, recklessly, heroically. One driver, Pyotr Kharitonov, later recalled, "I did not know if the war would end, but I knew that if I stopped, someone would die." He was right. Every tank that ran out of fuel was a coffin waiting to be filled. Every delay in supply meant another unit left to fight alone. And so, the convoys never stopped. Not for snow, not for artillery, not even for death. When a truck was destroyed, others drove around it. When a bridge collapsed, drivers built one from the wreckage. By the time Soviet forces reached Warsaw, the machine had reached its peak. More than 6,000 supply trains were in motion daily, supported by over 500,000 vehicles. The Germans, once masters of movement, now watched in disbelief as their enemies advanced faster then they could retreat. The Wehrmacht's officers still spoke in terms of divisions and regiments. The Soviets spoke in tons and kilometers. The language of war had changed. It was now written in steel and fuel. Even the air had become part of the system. Cargo planes ferried fuel and ammunition to forward bases. Helicopters, still crude and experimental, carried wounded men out of forests where roads didn't exist. At night, flares turned the sky red as railway artillery fired from flat cars that had been converted into mobile fortresses. Every piece of machinery was adapted, repurposed, driven to its limits. Efficiency was irrelevant. Only endurance mattered. In January 1945, the Vistula-Oder offensive began, the final sprint to Berlin. It was the culmination of everything the Red Army had learned: how to move faster, fight longer, and build in the middle of destruction. More than 2 million soldiers surged westward, supported by 4,000 tanks and 40,000 guns. Behind them rolled the convoys, tens of thousands of trucks carrying ammunition, rations, and dreams of revenge. When the order came to advance, the sound was like thunder rolling across the horizon. Entire forests shook. From the air, observers described it as a river of iron flowing endlessly toward the west. Bridges groaned under its weight. The very earth seemed to move. German soldiers who had once marched through these same lands in triumph now fled through the snow, pursued by the same engines they had mocked as crude. Those crude engines now carried the judgment of millions. The advance moved faster than any general had dared predict. 70 kilometers a day, sometimes more. Berlin was still hundreds of kilometers away, but already its shadow loomed. The Germans destroyed rail lines and bridges in desperation. It didn't matter. Soviet engineers followed the front like ghosts, rebuilding behind the flames. By the time a German bridge was blown, another Soviet one was already halfway complete. It wasn't order that kept the system alive. It was chaos mastered. The Red Army had learned to improvise on a continental scale. Ammunition trains ran without schedules. Repair crews appeared where they were needed, not where they were ordered. Decisions that once required headquarters approval were made by sergeants in the field. The system looked disorderly. To German eyes, it was madness. But that madness was faster than reason. When the Red Army crossed into Germany proper, soldiers found a world that looked eerily empty. Villages abandoned, cities hollowed out by retreat. The Germans had spent their last months destroying everything: bridges, roads, factories, believing that without them, the Soviets would stall. But they misunderstood the nature of their enemy. The Red Army did not depend on infrastructure. It was infrastructure. It carried its roads, its bridges, its factories with it. In the ruins of East Prussia, workers built an entire railhead in 3 days using nothing but salvaged wood and wreckage. Fuel depots were established inside bombed-out castles. Field kitchens operated in church courtyards. An empire was rebuilding itself on the march. The Germans had taught the world that modern war was about speed. The Soviets had perfected it, but in a different way. Not as a lightning strike, but as an avalanche. Heavy, inevitable, and unstoppable. By March 1945, the Red Army stood at the Oder. Berlin was 60 kilometers away. In every direction, the sound of engines filled the air, tanks idling, trains arriving, convoys forming. The soldiers could smell the victory they had carried across 4 years and 10 million graves. They had turned mud into roads, ruins into supply lines, desperation into strength. The war that began with retreat had become an advance that nothing could stop. In the freezing wind, one old truck driver stood beside his vehicle and looked west. He had driven since 1941, through snow, fire, famine, and grief. And now, the road ended in the enemy's capital. He lit a cigarette with shaking hands and said quietly, "We started this war with nothing, but we learned how to move. And once we started moving, nothing in this world could stop us again." April 1945, the world itself seemed to hold its breath. Across the plains of Germany, spring tried to bloom and failed. The soil was too heavy with oil and blood, the air too thick with smoke. What was left of the Wehrmacht still fought like a dying animal, clawing at the edges of a collapsing empire. But the Red Army was already there, at the gates of Berlin, bringing with it 4 years of vengeance and momentum that no wall, no city, no man could stop. The machine had come full circle. It had started in the ashes of Moscow, run on starvation and will, and now it stood poised to end the greatest war in human history. For the Soviet High Command, Berlin was not merely a military objective, it was a destination carved into every supply manifest, every bridge, every heartbeat since 1941. But the closer they came, the harder the journey became. Roads were rubble, bridges blown, rail lines twisted and mined. Germany had become one vast ruin, and yet the Red Army's logistics did not collapse. It adapted. Where no rails existed, trucks replaced trains. Where roads ended, tracked vehicles pulled convoys through the mud. Fuel was siphoned from captured depots, ammunition forged from enemy stockpiles. The Soviet supply machine devoured the Reich's remains and turned them into the instruments of its own destruction. Fuel trucks, once painted with red stars, now bore German insignia, captured and repurposed. Even Panzer engines powered Soviet vehicles. What the Germans had built for conquest now served their defeat. By April, 1,000 trains still moved daily toward the front. Every one of them loaded to the edge of possibility. Steel, bread, vodka, ammunition, hope. The machine no longer cared about efficiency. It cared only about direction. West, always west. In the forests east of Berlin, the marshes glowed with the reflection of burning towns. The front was not a line anymore. It was a wave. 2.5 million soldiers pressing forward through mud and flame. To keep them alive required more than courage. It required a miracle every hour. Bridges were rebuilt with corpses still floating beneath them. Rail tracks were laid through fire. Convoys drove on roads that no longer existed, their wheels carving new paths through the ruins. Drivers carried extra fuel cans strapped to their bodies. Mechanics welded armor in the open while bombs fell around them. They were not supposed to survive. And yet, they did. Because there was nowhere left to retreat. A Soviet logistics officer wrote in his diary, "We no longer measure distance, we measure exhaustion." When the assault on Berlin began, the world's largest supply operation moved with it. Invisible but vital. Every shell fired by the artillery, every bullet that tore through the Reichstag's walls had been carried there by someone whose name history would never remember. Each soldier who raised a flag had behind him 1,000 unseen hands that kept him fed, armed, and alive. In those final days, the system that had begun in chaos reached its perfect form. Organized disorder. Orders meant little now. What mattered was momentum. Commanders improvised routes hourly. When one road became impassable, drivers took to tram lines, sidewalks, or sewers. When gasoline ran out, they burned alcohol, paint thinner, even cooking oil. Berlin was a maze of ruins, and yet, somehow, the machine kept moving through it, like blood through the veins of a dying body. Even the sky joined the supply chain. Soviet planes dropped food and ammunition into the city's smoking streets. Pilots navigated by the fires below. Each landing strip was a crater field. Each delivery was made through hell itself. The soldiers joked bitterly that even the air smelled of steel and gasoline. The perfume of victory. Inside Berlin, the Germans fought with the desperation of ghosts. Hitler still raged in his bunker, demanding armies that no longer existed. Above him, the Red Army advanced street by street, block by block, powered by the same unstoppable logistics that had carried it from the Volga to the Reichstag. The artillery barrage that preceded the final assault was like nothing the world had ever heard. Over 1 million shells in 24 hours. The ground shook like an earthquake. Entire districts disappeared beneath the storm, and behind the thunder, the trains kept coming. They brought more shells, more rockets, more vengeance than the Germans had believed the earth could hold. On April 30th, when Soviet troops stormed the Reichstag, the sky above Berlin glowed orange. The building was a fortress, its walls riddled with bullets, its halls filled with smoke and screams. And yet, through that chaos, soldiers carried a red flag to the roof, the same banner that had been dyed in the blood of Stalingrad, carried through Kursk, through Minsk, through Warsaw. When they raised it, they were not just ending a battle. They were completing the greatest act of endurance in history. The war had begun with retreat, with hunger, with despair. It ended with the roar of engines, the rattle of tank treads, the crash of artillery. The voice of a nation that had learned how to move and never stop. For the men and women who kept the machine alive, victory felt almost unreal. They had worked so long without rest that even peace seemed like a rumor. Truck drivers sat beside their engines, staring into the fires they had followed across 4,000 kilometers. Railway workers fell asleep beside tracks still hot from the last train. Mechanics wiped grease from their hands and cried. Not from joy, but from relief. The road had finally ended. Berlin was in ruins. The war was over. But in that wreckage, something greater than victory had been built. A truth that the world would take decades to understand. It was not tanks or generals that had defeated the Reich. It was movement. It was the endless, grinding human rhythm of production, repair, and persistence. The Germans had believed in precision. The Soviets had believed in endurance. And endurance had won. The last trains rolled in silence, carrying supplies that would never be used. The last convoys parked their trucks on roads leading nowhere. Engines cooled for the first time in years. The men listened to the stillness and realized they had forgotten what silence sounded like. A colonel wrote in his report, dated May 9th, 1945, "We have reached the end of the road, not the end of war, only the end of movement." May 1945. The world exhaled. For the first time in 4 years, the engine stopped. No more convoys rumbling through the night. No more whistles in the dark. No more shudder of iron wheels beneath frozen earth. The war that had devoured 27 million lives ended not with a roar, but with the quiet hiss of cooling metal. On the roads outside Berlin, Soviet trucks stood abandoned, their paint scorched, their tires melted into the mud. The drivers, men and women who had not slept properly in years, sat beside them in silence, unable to comprehend what victory was supposed to feel like. They had carried war across a continent, and now there was nowhere left to go. The machine had stopped moving, but its echo still filled the air. In the months that followed, the Soviet Union faced a new kind of battle. One without gunfire. One fought not with bullets, but with memory. The same rails and roads that had carried death westward now carried life in return. Trains that once hauled tanks now brought home refugees. Convoys that once delivered shells now carried bread, medicine, and letters from the living to the living. Entire cities had to be rebuilt from foundations that no longer existed. Smolensk, Minsk, Stalingrad. They were not places anymore, but scars on the map. Yet somehow the same hands that had built the war machine now began building again. The welders who forged tank armor now welded bridges. The machinists who built cannons now assembled tractors. Even the women who had worked in the shadow of furnaces returned to the same factories. But this time, their sparks were for peace. Factories that had been evacuated to the Urals returned home piece by piece. Railways stretched across the continent once more, but now they carried timber, glass, coal, not soldiers. Children who had grown up knowing only war watched the trains pass and wondered why no one was shooting at them anymore. For years, they had lived inside a single endless motion, east to west, retreat to advance, destruction to vengeance. When that motion ceased, the silence was almost unbearable. Veterans of the Supply Corps, the invisible army of drivers, mechanics, and railway workers, received no parades. No medals were pinned to the men who rebuilt roads under fire or kept tanks alive with their bare hands. Their glory was measured in endurance, not in victories. And yet, among soldiers, they were remembered differently. Infantrymen spoke their names with reverence. Tanker crews toasted them at every celebration. For the men at the front knew the truth that history too often forgets. Wars are not won by fighting. They are won by moving. A rifleman could win a battle. A supply train could win a war. In 1946, a journalist visited the ruins of Stalingrad. Among the twisted girders of the Red October factory, he found an old woman hammering a rusted pipe back into place. She had worked there since 1941. He asked her why she had come back after everything. She smiled, toothless, tired, still unbroken, and said, "We built the wall. Now we build the world." That was the spirit of the years that followed. A nation so used to motion that even peace became a kind of work. Railway brigades crossed the Volga again, not with ammunition, but with school books and timber. Convoys rolled across the same roads, carrying bread instead of shells. The great machine of war became the foundation of reconstruction, a living monument of iron and endurance. The Red Army returned home with its weapons, but it was the mechanics, the engineers, and the drivers who carried the future. They had learned to solve the impossible, to move entire cities, to feed millions across broken continents, to create order out of ruin. They would do the same now, for peace. For decades afterward, the world would study their methods. NATO officers, Western historians, economists, all would pore over the records of Soviet logistics and shake their heads in disbelief. How had a country starving in 1941 managed to outproduce and outmove the most industrialized nation in Europe? How had chaos defeated order? How had willpower replaced precision? The answer could not be found in numbers. It was found in people. People who refused to stop moving even when everything else had stopped working. The war had turned them into something new, a civilization of motion. They had carried their nation through apocalypse and out the other side, powered by exhaustion, faith, and something deeper than either, duty. In the years that followed, monuments were built to the fallen soldiers, to the generals, to the battles. But in villages from the Volga to the Oder, there were quieter memorials. A rusted truck left to rest by a riverbank. A piece of rail track set upright like a cross. A stone engraved with nothing but a date and a name no one remembered. These were the monuments to the ones who kept the machine alive. The ones who never fired a shot, but whose engines roared louder than any cannon. And somewhere, perhaps, a few of those old drivers still lived to see the peace they had carried on their backs. They would sit on the porches of rebuilt towns, watching the trains roll by, slower now, heavier with harvest instead of war, and listen to the rhythm they had once known so well, the heartbeat of a nation that refused to stop. Because in the end, the story of the Great Patriotic War was not only one of blood and sacrifice. It was a story of movement, of a people who learned that motion itself was survival. From the factories of the Urals to the ruins of Berlin, the Soviet Union had turned wheels, rails, and human will into the most powerful weapon on earth. And when it was over, when the guns fell silent, when the smoke lifted, the roads they built, the bridges they forged, and the tracks they laid remained, not as scars but as veins of a living land, proof that endurance, not speed, defines strength, that empires fall, but those who keep moving, they endure. The engines cooled, the fires dimmed, but the roads were still there, waiting for the next generation to decide where to go.